In colonial Rhodesia, the government passed legislation making it illegal for archaeologists to conclude that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. The city was still standing. The walls, dry stone construction, granite blocks fitted without mortar, some reaching 11 meters, had been standing for 600 years. At its peak between 1200 and 1450 CE, Great Zimbabwe housed approximately 18 people across a 7.22 square kilometer complex. The Great Enclosure, the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, was built from 900 granite blocks fitted without mortar, without scaffolding, without iron tools in the construction of the walls themselves. The enclosure wall is 250 meters in circumference and 11 meters high. Stability in a dry stone structure of this height is not simple. It is calculated. The construction required a centralized state. Someone organized the quarrying, the transport, the cutting, and the placement of 900 granite blocks. Someone administered a city of 18 people. Someone controlled the gold trade that funded it, a network connecting southern Africa to the Swahili coast, to the Arabian Peninsula, to China. The first archaeologist sent to investigate arrived with a required conclusion. James Theodore Bent arrived at Great Zimbabwe in 1891, sent by the British South Africa Company Cecil Rhodes Company. His brief was to find evidence of non-African origin. He found pottery, soapstone carvings, and gold objects produced by a medieval African civilization. He concluded the builders were Arab. Gertrude Catan Thompson excavated the site in 1929. She was British, she was thorough, and she was not funded by the British South Africa Company. Her stratigraphic evidence was definitive. Great Zimbabwe was built by Bantu-speaking Africans in the medieval period. She published her findings. The official position did not change for 40 years. By the 1960s, the Rhodesian government under Ian Smith had made the suppression official. Archaeologists who reached the correct conclusion were removed from their positions. Publication of findings concluding African origin was prohibited. The colonial project required the impossibility of African civilization. The walls were there, the gold was there, the city was there. The conclusion was illegal. Sub-Saharan Africa had no medieval urban civilization. Contact with the outside world, Arab traders, European explorers, was the precondition for complexity of this scale. Before contact, there were no cities, no centralized states, no long-distance trade networks that connected to the wider world. This was not a contested claim in European and colonial educational systems. It was the curriculum. Sub-Saharan Africa had no medieval urban civilization. The stone cities came after contact. Africans built it. They built it in 1200. The city's existence does not simply contradict the model. It destroys the specific mechanism the model relied on. The claim that contact was the precondition for complexity of this scale. Great Zimbabwe was built, expanded, and trading gold with China before contact. Every claim the consensus made about pre-contact African civilization is falsified by one complex of walls and one city. The city does not contradict the model. The city makes the model impossible. The city is evidence. The prohibition is proof. The capability was real. The impossibility was declared. The institution had Catan Thompson's definitive findings in 1929. The official position did not change for 40 years after those findings were published. The decision to maintain the false model was made with full knowledge of the correct answer. The suppression of Great Zimbabwe was not ignorance, it was policy. The official timeline of pre-colonial African civilization was not produced by incomplete evidence. It was produced by institutions that understood what the evidence showed and prohibited the showing. The timeline was not wrong, it was constructed. Between 1871 and 1929, Great Zimbabwe was attributed to Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, Arabs, the Queen of Sheba, and a pre-Bantu white civilization. Every proposed builder had one feature in common: none of them were African. The variety of proposed non-African builders was not the product of genuine historical uncertainty. It was institutional commitment to any answer except the correct one. Gertrude Catan Thompson's 1929 findings were definitive. Her stratigraphic evidence placed the construction of Great Zimbabwe in the medieval period and in the hands of Bantu-speaking Africans. She was attacked. Her correct conclusion was not adopted as the official position for 40 years after she published it. In Rhodesian schools in the 1960s and 1970s, the official curriculum taught that Great Zimbabwe was built by a non-African civilization. The children who attended those schools grew up inside the country that contained it. The archaeologists who reached the correct conclusion were removed. The children who lived near the walls were taught the walls were not theirs. The builders are gone. The prohibition that erased them is gone. Great Zimbabwe stands in a country that now bears its name, and what the people who built it knew about themselves, recorded nowhere, held in no manuscript, transmitted in no archive that survived, is gone in the way that only happens when the institution that controls the record decides that the people who built the walls were impossible. In 1100 CE, Cahokia was the largest city in North America, and it was larger than London. London in 1100 CE had approximately 15 people. Cahokia had more than 20. At the city's center stood Monk's Mound, a flat-topped earthen pyramid whose base covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built entirely by hand, without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals. 22 million cubic feet of earth moved by human labor across 3 centuries of construction. A city of 20 requires food production, distribution, governance, and dispute resolution at scale. Cahokia had all of these. Its layout, a central plaza flanked by the mound complex, was planned. The urban design reveals administrative intentionality. Cahokia sat at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, the largest river junction in North America. Artifacts from Cahokia have been found from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians. The city was the center of a continental trading network. Around 1350 CE, Cahokia was abandoned. The population dispersed. The city did not fall to conquest. It did not fall to disease. It was abandoned before European contact, and no European ever saw it occupied. The reason for the abandonment is unknown. The only records of Cahokia are the mounds and the artifacts. There is no written record. The governance, the religion, the decisions, the names of the leaders, the names of the people, nothing was written. A city larger than London left no text. The largest city in North America for 700 years, no written record, no European witness. The history begins after it ended. Pre-Columbian North America was sparsely populated by hunter-gatherer societies and small agricultural communities. Urban civilization, cities, centralized states, long-distance trade networks of continental scale did not exist in North America before European contact. The complexity that European settlers found when they arrived was the complexity of peoples who had not yet developed urban civilization. North America's urban history begins with European settlement. Pre-Columbian North America had no urban civilization. Cities came with Europeans. Cahokia had 20 people in 1100. The official history of North America begins with European contact. 1492 is the founding date. Cahokia proves this starting point is wrong. The continent had urban civilization, continental trade networks, and planned cities 4 centuries before Europeans arrived. The history of North America did not begin in 1492. It began at least 1,000 years earlier, and the record of that beginning is almost entirely lost. Cahokia was abandoned before European contact. No European recorded it while it was alive. The archaeology reveals the physical structure. It cannot reveal the inner life, the governance, the religion, the names, the decisions, the knowledge accumulated over 4 centuries of urban civilization. A city larger than London left no text and no living memory. The official history of North America is not an incomplete account of what happened. It is an account that begins after the most complex chapter ended, because the institution that wrote the history arrived after the city was gone and needed the continent to be empty. Monk's Mound is the largest earthwork in North America. Its base is larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in stages over 3 centuries. The labor required, 22 million cubic feet of earth moved by hand, implies a workforce organized and sustained across generations. No single ruler could have mandated its construction. It required institutional continuity. At Cahokia, archaeologists found post holes arranged in precise circles, the remains of massive wooden posts used to track the solstices and equinoxes with astronomical precision. The astronomical calendar governed planting cycles and ceremonial life for a city of 20. In one burial mound at Cahokia, a single individual was interred on a platform of 20, shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around this individual were the bodies of 53 young women and 4 men who had been sacrificed. The burial reveals a religious and political system of extraordinary complexity. The Falcon burial is in a museum in Illinois. The name of the man buried on 20 shell beads and the names of the 53 women buried with him will never be known. Cahokia is gone. The mounds are still there. The 4 centuries of urban civilization that preceded European contact are gone in the way that only happens when the history begins after the city ends and calls the silence that preceded it emptiness. In 900 CE, Chinese porcelain was being unloaded on the docks of Kilwa, an East African city the official history says had no contact with China for another 500 years. The trading network was not one ship. Archaeological digs across the Swahili coast, Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Mozambique, have produced Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Indian beads from the 9th and 10th centuries. The network was systematic. Kilwa itself was a city of stone buildings on an island off the coast of modern Tanzania. Ibn Battuta visited in 1330 and called it one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, built in the 11th century, expanded in the 14th, is the largest medieval mosque in sub-Saharan Africa. Coral architecture, vaulted ceilings. A city, the Swahili coast city-states exported gold, ivory, iron, and enslaved people northward, and received porcelain, glass, and textiles from China, Persia, and India. The monsoon wind system made the Indian Ocean a highway. The same winds that carried dhows north to Arabia in summer carried them south to East Africa in winter. The trade was seasonal, predictable, and continuous for centuries. The Swahili city-states produced written chronicles, the Kilwa Chronicle, the Pate Chronicle, in Arabic script. These chronicles record the dynastic histories of the city-states, the names of their rulers, their relationships with the inland kingdoms that supplied them with gold. The inner life of the civilization is not entirely lost. It is in Arabic script on manuscript pages that European historians did not look for. Vasco da Gama reached the Swahili coast in 1498. He found sophisticated cities, literate populations, and maritime traders who knew the Indian Ocean better than any European navigator. He hired a Swahili pilot to guide him to India. The Portuguese then systematically destroyed the Swahili city-states over the following century. The Kilwa Chronicle and the Pat Chronicle survive. The libraries of the Swahili city-states do not. The Portuguese burned what they found. The porcelain was in the ground. The chronicles survived. The libraries burned. The pilot who guided the Portuguese to India is unnamed in every European account of the voyage. East Africa did not trade directly with China. Contact between sub-Saharan Africa and the wider Asian world was mediated through Arab intermediaries who controlled the Indian Ocean trade routes and redistributed goods southward. Direct African maritime capability, the ability to navigate and trade across the Indian Ocean independently, did not exist in the medieval period. East Africa received what Arab traders brought. It did not go out to get it. East Africa did not trade directly with China. Arab traders were the intermediaries. The porcelain was already there. Chinese porcelain in Kilwa is not evidence of Arab intermediary trade. It is evidence of direct contact. Chinese records from the Song dynasty document direct diplomatic and trade missions to East Africa. East African envoys visited the Chinese court. Chinese ships reached the East African coast. The trade was bilateral, documented in Chinese records, and absent from the official history of East Africa because the official history was written by Europeans who arrived 5 centuries after the trade was established. The porcelain was in the ground the entire time. The ground was not consulted. The official history of Africa's engagement with the wider world begins with European contact. What the construction required was the retroactive erasure of everything that existed before that contact. The official history of Africa's relationship with the wider world begins with European contact, because the institution that wrote the history was the institution that arrived last and needed its arrival to be the beginning. The Yongle Emperor of China sent Zheng He's fleet on 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433, reaching East Africa, bringing back giraffes, and establishing diplomatic relationships that predated European contact by 60 years. The Chinese had a name for the East African coast. The Swahili had Chinese maps. The relationship was documented on both sides. European historians did not look at the Chinese side. In 1415, the king of Malindi sent a giraffe to the Chinese imperial court. It arrived in Beijing and was received as a qilin, a symbol of good omen. The king of Malindi knew what he was sending. He had access to diplomatic intelligence about what the Chinese emperor would value. His name is in the Chinese records. He is not in the history of the Swahili coast taught in most schools. The man who guided Vasco da Gama from the Swahili coast to India in 1498, the navigator whose knowledge made the first European voyage to India possible, is referred to in Portuguese records as a Moor. His name was Ahmad ibn Majid. Ahmad ibn Majid wrote 39 navigational texts about the Indian Ocean and guided Da Gama's fleet to India in 1498. The voyage that opened the age of exploration was navigated by a man the official history of that exploration does not name. The porcelain is in the ground. The libraries the Portuguese burned are gone. What East African civilization built across centuries of Indian Ocean contact before Europe arrived is gone, in the way that only happens when the civilization that arrives last writes the history of arrival and calls itself the beginning. The road system the Spanish found when they arrived in the Andes in 1532 had been built, not by the Inca, but by a civilization that collapsed 300 years before the Inca existed. The Wari road system covered approximately 40 kilometers, as much as the Roman road system, built across mountain passes, coastal deserts, and tropical forests. The kingdom of Huari at its peak had a population of approximately 70 people, larger than any contemporary European city. The Huari Empire at its greatest extent covered most of modern Peru and parts of Bolivia and Ecuador. It was the first pan-Andean empire. The Huari built administrative centers called Huanca, planned urban complexes built to a standardized architectural template across the empire, storage facilities for redistribution of goods, a road system, a textile recording system that parallels and may predate the Inca Quipu. The Huari invented the administrative toolkit the Inca are celebrated for. The Inca did not emerge independently of the Huari. Their capital, Cusco, was built on or near a Huari administrative site. Their architectural style incorporates Huari forms. Their administrative system mirrors the Huari system. The Inca did not invent their civilization. They inherited it and expanded it. The Inca did not acknowledge their predecessors. The Huari Empire collapsed around 1000 CE, 500 years before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish asked the Inca about the ruins they found. The Inca said they did not know who built them. The civilization that built the infrastructure of the Andes was erased by its successors before the Europeans arrived to write the history. The Huari left no decoded written record. The administrative knowledge they developed survived through the Inca. The knowledge of who developed it did not. The roads were there before the Inca. The cities were there before the Inca. The administrative system was there before the Inca. The history begins with the Inca. The Inca Empire was one of the greatest civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. At its peak, it stretched 4 kilometers along the western coast of South America. The Inca built the road system that connected it. They built the administrative centers that managed it. They developed the Quipu, the knotted string recording system, to govern it. 5 centuries of scholarship on pre-Columbian America confirms this. The Inca built the road system. The Inca built the administrative infrastructure of the Andes. The Huari built the roads first. The Inca did not create the administrative civilization of the Andes. They inherited it, expanded it, and were the version of it that the Spanish encountered. The history of Andean civilization credited to the Inca belongs to a longer story, one that begins with the Huari and possibly earlier, and the Inca are the final chapter that European contact preserved, rather than the origin the history assumed. The Huari and the Inca together demonstrate a pattern. Civilizations that preceded and enabled the civilizations Europeans encountered are absent from the history because the Europeans arrived after them and their successors did not acknowledge them. The Inca erased the Huari. The Spanish recorded the Inca. The history contains the Inca because they were there when the pen arrived. The Huari were not. The official history of pre-Columbian civilization is not the history of what existed. It is the history of what existed when Europeans arrived, and everything that existed before that moment and was not transmitted forward by the civilizations Europeans encountered has no history at all. Piquilacta was a Huari administrative center in the Cusco Valley, the same valley the Inca later chose for their capital. It was abandoned approximately 500 years before the Inca built Cusco nearby. The Inca built their empire's center in the ruins of the civilization whose administrative system they inherited. They did not record this. Huari textiles are among the most technically complex pre-Columbian objects known, interlocked tapestry weave producing geometric patterns of extraordinary precision. The technical tradition was transmitted to the Inca. The Inca textile tradition is built on Huari foundations. The Huari weavers are not named. The Wari Empire collapsed around 1000 CE. The cause is unknown. Climate change, internal conflict, and resource depletion have all been proposed. None has been confirmed. The Wari built the roads the Spanish traveled to reach the Inca and were gone 500 years before the Spanish arrived. No one the Spanish encountered knew who had built them. The Wari are gone. What they built is attributed to their successors. The 4 centuries of administrative innovation that made the Inca Empire possible are gone in the way that only happens when the civilization that inherits the infrastructure inherits the credit with it, and the people who built the roads are not in the history of the road. In 2015, satellite imaging revealed that the medieval city of Angkor was 4 times larger than archaeologists had believed, and that it had sustained a population of 1 million people using a water management system nobody had understood. The system was not a simple canal network. LiDAR imaging revealed a hydraulic infrastructure covering 3 square kilometers, a network of canals, reservoirs, and distribution channels engineered to capture monsoon rainfall and distribute it through the dry season. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument in the world, covers 162 hectares and was built in the 12th century. The known city around it was already extraordinary. The LiDAR imaging revealed suburbs, industrial areas, agricultural zones, and hydraulic infrastructure extending 40 kilometers beyond the known temple complex. The city was not a dense urban center surrounded by jungle. It was a low-density urban sprawl covering 1 square kilometers larger than modern Los Angeles. The Khmer engineers built interconnected reservoirs, barrays, some covering 16 square kilometers, linked by canals distributing water through the dry season. The largest barray, the West Barray, holds 53 million cubic meters of water. It was built by hand in the 11th century. It still holds water. Tropical Southeast Asia receives most of its rainfall in 4 months of the year. Sustaining a city of 1 million through the dry season required capturing and storing monsoon rainfall at scale. The Khmer solution worked for 5 centuries. The LiDAR revealed hydraulic channels requiring calculations of seasonal water flow across 3 square kilometers, channels whose construction required engineering knowledge of hydrology and soil mechanics that the previous ground-level archaeology had not identified. Agricultural zones organized to supply 1 million people. Infrastructure whose scope overturned not just the estimate of the city's size but the estimate of the civilization's capability. The largest pre-industrial city in the world. 1 million people. A hydraulic system covering 3 square kilometers. Not understood until 2015. Medieval civilization outside Europe and the Islamic world did not achieve urban engineering at the scale required to sustain cities of 1 million. The logistics, food production, water supply, waste management, governance required for a pre-industrial city of this size did not exist outside the major civilizational centers of Europe, the Middle East, and China. Southeast Asia in the medieval period had significant temple complexes and regional kingdoms. It did not have cities of this scale sustained by hydraulic engineering. Medieval Southeast Asia had no city of this scale. The engineering required had not been developed. A satellite found it in 2015. The Khmer engineers solved the most difficult problem in pre-industrial urban management, sustaining a large tropical city through a seasonal water crisis, at a scale no other medieval civilization attempted. The solution worked for 5 centuries. When the system failed around 1400 CE, the city collapsed. The city did not fall. The system failed. When the system failed, the city followed. The largest pre-industrial city in the world was invisible to Western archaeology until satellite imaging. This is not a criticism of individual archaeologists. The system was genuinely invisible from the ground. It is a demonstration that the official timeline of medieval urban civilization was limited not by what existed, but by what the tools of the institution doing the looking could see. The official history of medieval engineering is the history of what medieval engineering looked like from a Western vantage point. And the civilizations that built at a scale or in a location that Western archaeology could not see from that vantage point are absent from it. Not because they did not build, but because no one looked at the right scale until it was too late to ask them how. The Khmer hydraulic system required continuous maintenance. The channels had to be kept clear, the earthworks repaired after floods. When the system began to fail around 1400 CE, the capacity to maintain it at full scale degraded. A city of 1 million sustained by water management infrastructure is more vulnerable than a city sustained by rain-fed agriculture. When the management fails, the city fails. The collapse was not conquest, it was infrastructure failure. After the abandonment of Angkor, the jungle reclaimed the outer urban zones within decades. The temples survived because they were stone. The residential areas, the administrative buildings, the outer canal system, built of wood, earth, and laterite, were reclaimed. What the LiDAR found in 2015 were the earthwork signatures of what had been there. The buildings themselves are gone. The Khmer engineers who built and maintained the Bara system for 5 centuries held knowledge of hydrology, of soil mechanics, of seasonal water management at scale that died with the system. The specific technical knowledge that made the system work is not in any surviving text. The West Baray still holds water, built by hand in the 11th century. It has never been emptied. What the engineers who built it understood about sustaining 1 million people through a dry season is not in any surviving text. The Baray still holds water. The city it sustained is gone. The 5 centuries of hydraulic engineering knowledge that sustained the largest pre-industrial city in the world are gone in the way that only happens when the system that required the knowledge fails before the knowledge is written down, and the jungle takes the rest. In 1960, archaeologists excavating a site in Newfoundland confirmed that Norse settlers had been living in North America since approximately 1000 CE, and that mainstream scholarship had been dismissing the evidence as impossible for 60 years. The site, Lance aux Meadows, contained 8 structures consistent with Norse architectural style, long houses and workshops, a bronze cloak pin of Norse design, iron boat rivets, a spindle whorl, the debris of an iron smelter, the first evidence of iron working in the Americas. The site was not a campsite, it was a settlement with industrial capability. The Norse sagas, Eric's Saga and the Saga of the Greenlanders, describe a land called Vinland to the west of Greenland, reached by Leif Erikson around 1000 CE. The sagas describe the landscape, the native peoples, the resources. Medieval Norse scholars, Scandinavian historians, and eventually mainstream archaeology all knew the sagas existed. The question was whether they described a real place. Lance aux Meadows confirmed they did. The sagas had been known to European scholars since the 17th century. The hypothesis that Vinland was in North America was proposed repeatedly by Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffen in 1837, by others throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each proposal was rejected by mainstream scholarship. The grounds for rejection were not archaeological, they were institutional. The date 1492 was too important to move. The Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad spent 8 years searching the eastern coast of North America for the Norse settlement described in the sagas. They found Lance aux Meadows in 1960. Anne Stein Ingstad directed 7 years of excavations confirming the site as Norse and dating it to approximately 1000 CE. After 1960, the textbooks added a footnote. The Norse reached North America around 1000 CE. The structure of the official history did not change. Columbus remained the beginning of the story. The reason? The Norse settlement was abandoned within a generation. It produced no lasting European presence. The history begins in 1492 because 1492 was when the permanent consequences began, not when the first Europeans arrived. The Norse were there in 1000. The evidence was there from 1960. The history begins in 1492 because that is when the consequences that matter to the historians began. European contact with the Americas began with Christopher Columbus in 1492. This is the foundational date of the history of the Western Hemisphere, the moment that connected the Old World and the New, initiating the exchange of peoples, plants, animals, and diseases that shaped the modern world. Before 1492, the Americas were isolated from Europe. The Norse voyages, if they occurred, left no lasting presence and changed nothing. The history of the Americas begins in 1492. That is not a Eurocentric claim. It is a statement about consequences. The history of European contact with the Americas begins in 1492. Before 1492, nothing lasting happened. The Norse arrived in 1000. Lance aux Meadows proves that the official history of European contact chose its starting point not based on when contact occurred, but based on when contact produced consequences that European historians valued. The Norse were in North America in 1000 CE. The history begins in 1492 because 1492 was consequential for Europeans. This is not a neutral choice. It is an institutional decision about which consequences count as history. The Norse settlement is different from every other item in this video. The history acknowledged 1000 CE and kept 1492 as the beginning anyway. The structure of the official history is resilient to correction because it is not organized around what happened. It is organized around what happened to Europeans and the civilizations that produced them. The official timeline is not a description of what occurred. It is a description of what occurred from a specific vantage point, the vantage point of the institution that wrote it, and everything that occurred outside that vantage point, before that vantage point arrived, or in ways that did not register as consequential to that vantage point, is absent from the record, not because it did not happen, but because the institution doing the recording was not there to record it. The sagas describe the Norse encountering the native peoples of Newfoundland, the Beothuk or their ancestors, whom they called Skraelings. The Norse attempted trade, conflicts followed. The settlement was eventually abandoned, possibly because of ongoing conflict with the native population. The native peoples who drove the Norse from North America in 1000 CE are mentioned in the sagas as obstacles. Their perspective on the encounter is not in any surviving record. The sagas describe Vinland as a land of wild grapes, salmon, and self-sown wheat. The resources the Norse found were the same resources European fishermen would exploit from the 1490s onward. The Norse knew what was there. The knowledge was in the sagas. The connection between Norse knowledge and later European colonization is not established. It is not impossible. The Lance os Meadows settlement was occupied for approximately 10 years before abandonment. The reason is not documented. The buildings were not burned. The tools were left behind. The Norse went home and did not come back for 500 years. When Europeans came back, they came in larger numbers with different intentions and wrote the history as if they were the first. The Beothuk, whose ancestors drove the Norse from North America in 1000 CE, were extinct by 1829, killed by European settlers who arrived 5 centuries after the Norse left. The last Beothuk, Shinaudithit, died in St. John's in 1829 and left drawings of her people, the only record made by someone who knew what had been lost. The Beothuk are gone. The Norse settlement is gone. The 5 centuries between the Norse departure and the European return are not a gap in the history of North America. They are the history of North America, and the peoples who lived in that gap left no record that the institution which arrived at the end of it chose to keep. In 330 CE, the kingdom of Aksum became a Christian state, 50 years before the Roman Empire made Christianity its official religion. The conversion was not nominal. King Ezana of Aksum converted, replaced the pre-Christian symbols on Aksumite coins with the Christian cross, and built churches across the kingdom. The state religion of Aksum was Christianity, with physical evidence in coins, inscriptions, and architecture, before Constantine's conversion of Rome was complete. The kingdom of Aksum at its peak was one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. The Chinese historian Liang Shu recorded this ranking in the 7th century. Aksum controlled both sides of the Red Sea, the African coast, and the Arabian Peninsula. Every ship moving between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean paid tribute or taxes to Aksum. Aksum minted its own gold coins from approximately 270 CE, before Constantine minted the first Roman gold salutis in 312 CE. The Aksumite gold coin was used in international trade across the Red Sea world. Roman traders accepted it. Persian traders accepted it. The Aksumite monetary system preceded the Roman gold standard that became the basis of medieval European economics. The Aksumite obelisks, carved granite monoliths reaching 33 meters in height, are among the largest single stone structures ever erected. The largest standing obelisk in the world is at Aksum. It was carved, transported, and erected in the 4th century CE. The obelisk that Mussolini looted in 1937 was returned to Ethiopia in 71 years after its theft. Aksum built churches in the 4th century CE. The rock-hewn churches of Tigray in northern Ethiopia, some dating to the 4th and 5th centuries, are among the oldest surviving Christian ecclesiastical structures in the world. They are carved directly into cliff faces. They predate any surviving European church of comparable scale. Physical evidence in stone. Aksum declined from the 7th century onward, partly due to the rise of Islam, which redirected Red Sea trade, partly due to deforestation and agricultural collapse. By the 10th century, the kingdom had contracted to the Ethiopian highlands. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is a direct institutional continuation of Aksumite Christianity. The political power ended. The tradition did not. The first Christian state was African. The first gold coin in the Red Sea world was African. The official history of both begins in Rome. The history of Christian civilization begins with Rome. Constantine's conversion in 312 CE and the Edict of Milan in 313 CE established Christianity as a tolerated religion in the Roman Empire. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established Christian orthodoxy. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. This sequence, from Constantine to the official imperial religion, is the origin story of Christian civilization as it shaped Europe, the Americas, and the modern world. Christian civilization began with Rome. The origin is Roman. Aksum converted in 330. The official history of Christian civilization is organized around Rome, not because Rome was first, but because Rome's version of Christianity was the one that survived and expanded into Europe and eventually into the global institution that wrote the history. Aksum's Christianity is older than Rome's official Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church uses liturgical traditions that predate the Council of Nicaea. The official history of Christian civilization begins in Rome because Rome wrote it, not because Rome was first. Aksum is the most direct example in this video of how the official timeline was constructed to serve the institution that produced it. The Catholic and later Protestant churches that shaped Western civilization needed the origin story of Christianity to begin in Rome, in the imperial tradition that their own institutional authority descended from. Aksum was not an inconvenient footnote. It was an institutional problem. The official timeline of Christian civilization is not the history of Christianity. It is the history of the branch of Christianity that became politically dominant in Europe, and everything that preceded it, paralleled it, or descended from a different branch, is absent from the official story because the institution that wrote the story needed the story to begin where its own authority began. The Ethiopian national epic, the Kibra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, was written down in the 14th century from oral traditions believed to date to the Aksumite period. It describes the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon, the birth of Menelik, and the transfer of the Ark to Ethiopia. The Kebra Nagast is one of the oldest and most complete national literary traditions in Africa. It is not in the standard curriculum of world literature. The rock-hewn churches of Tigray in northern Ethiopia, some dating to the 4th and 5th centuries CE, are among the oldest surviving Christian ecclesiastical structures in the world. They were maintained in continuous use from the Aksumite period to the present. They are not in the standard history of Christian architecture. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition holds that the Ark of the Covenant, the chest described in the Hebrew Bible as containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, was brought to Aksum by Menelik I in approximately 950 BCE. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum holds what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains is the Ark of the Covenant, and no independent verification has ever been permitted. Whether the claim is true is the oldest unanswered question in the oldest Christian state, and it will remain unanswered. Aksum is gone. The coins are in museums. The 17 centuries of Christian tradition that preceded and paralleled the European church that wrote the official history of Christianity are not in that history, because the institution that wrote it needed the story to begin where its own authority began, and Aksum was 50 years too early and one continent too far. When British forces looted the royal palace of Benin in 1897, the bronze objects they found were so technically sophisticated that European experts declared it was impossible for Africans to have made them. The experts proposed alternatives: Portuguese traders, a lost European expedition, ancient Egyptian craftsmen, a mysterious pre-African civilized race. Every proposed maker had one feature in common: none of them were African. The bronzes, more accurately brasses, cast in a copper-zinc tin alloy, were produced by the Kingdom of Benin from approximately the 13th century onward, using the lost wax casting technique. The precision of the finest Benin bronzes required multiple pours of carefully calculated alloys at temperatures requiring purpose-built furnaces. The technical complexity was not accidental. It was the product of a specialist guild system that had been refining the technique for centuries. The bronze casters of Benin, the Igun Eronwan, were a hereditary guild whose members lived in a dedicated quarter of Benin City, passed their techniques from father to son, and worked exclusively for the Oba. The guild is documented in oral tradition to the 13th century. Its technical tradition was continuous from the medieval period to 1897. The guild did not disappear after 1897. Its descendants still practice the tradition in Benin City today. The relief plaques, approximately 900 cast bronze panels, documented the history of the Kingdom of Benin. Scenes of court ceremony, military campaigns, diplomatic encounters, and royal succession were cast in bronze and displayed in the royal palace. The bronzes were not decorative objects. They were the historical record of the kingdom, the Benin equivalent of a written chronicle, cast in metal that would survive indefinitely. The British punitive expedition looted the palace in January 1897. Between 3 and 5, bronze objects were removed along with ivory carvings, regalia, and ceremonial objects. The bronzes were sold to cover the cost of the expedition. They dispersed across European museums and private collections. The historical record of the Kingdom of Benin is now in Berlin, London, New York, and Vienna. The declaration that Africans could not have produced the bronzes was made by European metallurgists and art historians looking at the objects. The bronze's existence contradicted the founding narrative of the colonization of West Africa, which required the absence of complex African civilization before European contact. Acknowledging that Africans had produced these objects independently contradicted the justification for the colonization that had just destroyed the civilization that made them. The declaration was not error, it was necessity. The objects were there, the makers were there, the guild was there. The declaration was made anyway. Pre-contact sub-Saharan African metallurgy did not achieve the technical complexity of lost wax casting at this level of refinement. Metalwork of this precision, requiring purpose-built furnaces, calculated alloys, specialist knowledge traditions maintained across generations, was a product of civilizations with the institutional infrastructure to support specialist guilds. The Islamic world, China, Europe, West Africa before European contact had ironworking. It did not have bronze casting of this technical sophistication. West African metallurgy before contact did not produce bronzes of this complexity. This level of craft required external knowledge. The guild had been working since 1300. The Egan Iran Wan's continuous technical tradition from the 13th century to 1897 is the complete refutation of the Wall's claim. No external instruction was required. No external instruction is evidenced. The technical complexity was achieved by a specialist knowledge tradition that developed internally over centuries. The declaration was made in the presence of the descendants of the people who had done it. The declaration was not about the evidence, it was about the conclusion the evidence required. The Declaration of Impossibility is the clearest single example in this video of how the official timeline was maintained against physical evidence, not suppressed evidence, evidence that was in the room. The European experts who declared the Benin bronzes impossible for Africans to have produced were holding the bronzes. The capability was real. The impossibility was declared. The official timeline of African civilization was not produced by an absence of evidence. It was produced by the institutional decision to declare the evidence impossible, to maintain that declaration against the objects themselves, in the presence of the people who made them, in the presence of the guild that was still working. The Benin bronzes are currently held in the British Museum, the Ethnologisches Museum Berlin, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and approximately 150 other institutions worldwide. The Kingdom of Benin has been requesting their return since the 1930s. Some institutions have begun returning objects. Most have not. The historical record of the Kingdom of Benin remains primarily in foreign museums. The 900 bronze relief plaques documented specific events, specific ceremonies, specific battles, specific diplomatic encounters, in a visual historical record of extraordinary detail. Art historians have identified individual rulers and individual moments across centuries of Benin history from the plaques. The history they record is currently being studied by European and American art historians in European and American museums. The Benin historians who would study them in context are studying photographs. The Egan Aranwan still practices in Benin City. The lost wax casting technique that European experts declared impossible for Africans to have developed is being practiced today by the descendants of the craftsmen who developed it. The guild's survival is the continuous physical refutation of the 1897 declaration. The man who currently leads the Egan Iranwan Guild in Benin City is the direct hereditary successor of the craftsmen who cast the bronzes in the British Museum. He has never been asked to authenticate them. The bronzes are in London. The Kingdom of Benin is gone. What the bronzes document, the centuries of technical knowledge and civilizational achievement of a kingdom the British expedition destroyed in a week, is gone in the way that only happens when the institution that loots the archive declares the archive's makers impossible and then studies the archive in museums the makers cannot enter. In 1932, a South African farmer found gold artifacts on a hilltop that proved a sophisticated African kingdom had been trading with China in the 13th century, and the apartheid government classified the findings and prohibited their publication. The gold objects were not ambiguous. A rhinoceros figurine hammered from gold foil over a wooden core, a bowl cast in gold, jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. The gold objects were produced using techniques consistent with a state-level gold-working tradition. The hilltop, Mapungubwe Hill, was a royal enclosure. The kingdom it represented had been trading gold northward for 3 centuries before it was found. Mapungubwe was a state-level society occupying the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers on the border of modern South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. At its peak, approximately 1300 CE, it had a population of approximately 9 people, a stratified social hierarchy evidenced by differential burial practices, and a gold-trading economy that connected it to the Swahili coast and through it to the Indian Ocean trade network that reached China. It was the predecessor state to Great Zimbabwe. Chinese porcelain and glass beads from the Indian Ocean trade have been found at Mapungubwe. Gold from Mapungubwe has been found in contexts consistent with export northward through the Swahili coast. The gold for porcelain exchange that the physical evidence records was part of the same Indian Ocean trading system that brought Chinese porcelain to Kilwa. Mapungubwe was the southern end of a continental gold trade connecting sub-Saharan Africa to China. K.L. Wallace found the gold artifacts on Mapungubwe Hill in 1932 and brought them to the University of Pretoria. The university archaeologist Leo Fouché excavated the site and confirmed it as a significant pre-colonial African civilization. The university recognized the importance of the findings. The apartheid government, which came to power in 1948, did not. The apartheid government classified the Mapungubwe findings. Access to the site was restricted. Publication of findings was prohibited without government approval. The ideological framework of apartheid required the narrative that southern Africa had been empty of complex civilization before white settlement. Mapungubwe, with its 13th century state-level civilization in the heart of South Africa, directly contradicted this narrative. The government suppressed the evidence. The Mapungubwe findings remained restricted from full public academic access until the end of apartheid in 1994. 62 years of official suppression of a medieval archaeological site. The international academic community knew Mapungubwe existed. It was not entirely secret. It was suppressed within South Africa, where the narrative it contradicted was the foundation of the state. The kingdom was there in 1220. The gold was there in 1932. The government suppressed the findings in 1948. The suppression ended in 1994. The suppression of African history is a historical problem, a product of the colonial era, the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European powers were establishing empires and needed narratives of African inferiority to justify them. The colonial period ended. Modern scholarship has corrected the worst distortions. The apartheid era in South Africa was the last major institutional suppression of African history, and it ended in 1994. The active suppression of African historical evidence belongs to the past. The suppression of African history belongs to the colonial past. It ended with colonialism. The apartheid government classified Mapungubwe in 1948. The suppression of Mapungubwe was not a colonial-era distortion. It was a mid-20th century government policy enforced with the institutional apparatus of a modern state: classification, restricted access, prohibited publication. The tools of suppression were the tools of a modern bureaucracy. The motivation was the same motivation that drove the colonial suppressions of Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili coast, a racial narrative that required the absence of African civilization. The motivation did not end with colonialism. It continued into the television age. Mapungubwe is the video's demonstration that the suppression of impossible civilizations is not confined to the distant past. The official timeline of African civilization was being actively maintained as a living government policy within living memory. Some of the people who enforced the suppression are still alive. The official timeline of what medieval civilizations were capable of was not produced in the distant past and forgotten. It was produced, maintained, and enforced as a living government policy by modern states with bureaucratic apparatus, and the last major enforcement ended not in the age of exploration, but in 1994, in the era of satellite television, and its effects on what is taught about African history in South African schools are still being corrected. The Mapungubwe collection at the University of Pretoria includes the golden rhinoceros, a rhinoceros figurine hammered from gold foil over a wooden core, approximately 15 centimeters long. It was suppressed by the apartheid government for 46 years. It became a symbol of pre-colonial African civilization after 1994. In 22, it was used as the design for South Africa's highest civilian honor, the Order of Mapungubwe. In South African schools under apartheid, the official curriculum taught that Southern Africa was essentially uninhabited before the arrival of both black African groups from the north and white settlers from the south, and that the two populations arrived at approximately the same time. This narrative required the absence of pre-colonial complex civilization in Southern Africa. Mapungubwe contradicted it. The government kept Mapungubwe out of the classroom for 62 years. The apartheid government's suppression of Mapungubwe and the Rhodesian government's suppression of Great Zimbabwe were not independent events. They were the same event, the same racial narrative, the same institutional mechanism enforced across 1,000 kilometers of southern Africa by two governments simultaneously, coordinated not by explicit agreement, but by shared ideological necessity. The apartheid government that classified Mapungubwe in 1948 governed South Africa until 1994, and the researchers who were prohibited from publishing their findings were alive when the prohibition ended. Some of them are still alive. The kingdom of Mapungubwe is gone. The golden rhinoceros is in a museum in Pretoria. The 62 years between the discovery of the gold and the end of the government that classified it are not a chapter in the history of colonialism, they are a chapter in the history of the 20th century, and the people who lived through them are still alive, and some of what they were not told about is still being recovered.